So I'm going to show you 5 methods of factoring. One is finding the greatest common factor. What does that mean? Basically, you're looking for a number that all the terms can be divided by evenly without having a decimal, right? So for example, we're going to do A together. X squared plus 8x. Two terms. We have an x squared term and we have a positive 8x term, right? What do both of these terms have in common? What can they both be divided by? They can both be divided by x, right? Which means that the greatest common factor is x. Okay? Well, factoring is the opposite of expanding. Division is the opposite of multiplication. Yeah. Which means that x times something will bring me back to this answer. Well, what's x squared divided by x to the power of 1? X. Positive 8x divided by x. This cancels out. We're left with positive 8. Okay, you can check to make sure that you actually got the right answer. Check by expanding. What's x times x? What's x times 8? Did we get the same answer? Yes. Okay, once again. What's the greatest common factor? What can both of these terms be divided by? X. So if I divide this by x and I divide this by x, opposite of division is multiplication. So if I can divide it by x, it means I can multiply it by x, right? X squared divided by x. Negative divided by a positive. Negative. This cancels out, and I'm left with 28. Okay? Greatest common factor is 2x. They both have x in common, and they can both be divided by 2. That's the greatest number that they're divisible by. So once you find the greatest common factor, divide each term by that number, or by that term, sorry. What's 4x squared divided by 2x? 2x, good. Negative divided by a positive. This cancels out. 6 divided by 2. That's it. The second type of factoring is if the expression looks like this. It's in the form x squared plus bx plus c. So as an example, x squared plus 8x, this is my b, plus c, plus c. What's my c value? Plus 12. We are looking for, okay, we'll draw a little chart here. Two numbers that multiply, so the product, they multiply together to give you, do you guys remember which value? B or C? C. Two numbers that multiply to give you C. So in this case, 12. So let's start with doing that. What are products of 12? What times what is 12? Let's start with 1 times 12. What else? 2 times, let's go in order. 6, 3 times 4. We want to know what the two factors are. Well, so first we look for two numbers that multiply together to give us 12. But when we add those two numbers up, they should add up to what? To B, which in this case is positive 8. So let's add these up. What's 1 plus 12? What's 2 plus 6? What's 3 plus 4? Which two numbers add up to 8? 2 and 6. Those are our factors. We have to write this in factored form. Once again, factored form, we're looking for two things that we multiply together, right? Factored form is showing it in a different way. Well, what times what gives you x squared? X times x. Remember this now? And we have a positive 2 and a positive 6. So plus 2, plus 6. That's factored form. If we were to expand this, it will bring us back to the original question. Factored form is just a different representation of standard form. We're looking for two things that multiply together to give us positive 18. But when we add up the numbers, they should equal what? You have to watch your sign. It's negative 9. Okay? So two things that multiply to a positive. Well, a positive times a positive gives you a positive. What else gives you a positive? A negative and a negative. So it's possible that we can have a negative and a negative. Right? What are factors of 18? What times what gives you 18? Negative 9 times negative 2 gives you 18. Yep. What else? Negative 6 and negative 3. Let's do one more. What about positive 6 and positive 3? Does that also multiply to give you 18? To give you positive 18? Figure out which of these two numbers adds up to negative 9. What's negative 9 plus negative 2? That's going to give us negative 11. What's negative 6 plus negative 3? Negative 9. And what's 6 plus 3? Positive 9. We were looking for something that adds up to negative 9. Which two numbers add up to negative 9? Negative 6 and negative 3. So how do I write this in factored form? X minus 6, X minus 3. Okay, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to give us negative 18 and adds up to what? Negative 3. Well, two numbers that multiply to give us negative 18. What's the only way you can result in a negative? A positive and a negative, okay? So we know that the two numbers have to be, one has to be positive, one has to be negative, because it has to multiply to give us a negative. So factors of 18. Let's start with 1. 1 and 18. Or negative 1 and positive 18, right? Either one. What else? Okay, so once you list all the factors, we want to see which one adds up to negative 3. What's 1 plus a negative 18? Is it negative 3? No, that one doesn't work. What is 3 plus negative 6? So 3 take away 6. Negative 3. What's negative 3 plus 6? Positive 3. Which one works? Right, this adds up to negative 3, and we already know that this multiplies to give us negative 18. So how do I write this in factored form? X plus 3 and X minus 6. Okay. So the third method of factoring is if you're given something that's called a perfect square trinomial. What does trinomial mean again? How many terms? 3 terms. And the first term and the last term are perfect squares. What's a perfect square? So a perfect square is a number that you can find the square root of, and the result won't be a decimal. So can you give me an example of a perfect square? 25, good. 25 is a perfect square. Why? What's the square root of 25? Good. Another perfect square is 36. 49. 4. 144. Good. So a perfect square trinomial means that the first term, I want you guys to copy this down, and the last term, which in this case would be the third term, right? So the first term and the third term, because there's only 3 terms, it's a trinomial. That means 3 terms. So the first term and third term are perfect squares. If you recognize that the first term and the last term are perfect squares, then you're going to use this method of factoring. It's the easiest one. Okay, so let me show you an example. Let's do A. X squared plus 20x plus 100. What's the first term here? Is this a perfect square? Yeah, what's the square root of x squared? So I know that my first term is going to be x. X times x is x squared. Is the last term a perfect square? What's the square root of 100? So the last term is going to be 10. If the operation is plus something, then both are going to be positive. If this was a negative, both factors will be negative. Okay? You'll see that when we actually expand this, x times x squared, x times 10, 10 times x, and then 10 times 10. The reason the 20 is there is because when we simplify this, it's x squared plus 20x plus 100. We got the same answer. That's how you can check it. So once again, to factor, we're writing the product of two values. Is this a perfect square trinomial? How do you know? The first and third term are perfect squares. So we can use this method. What's the square root of x squared? What's the square root of 16? And my middle term is what sign? So x take away 4, x take away 4. Last method of factoring. If the expression is a difference of squares, well, squares again means if it's a perfect square. What does it mean to find the difference in math? Okay, so if the terms are separated by subtraction, and if both terms are perfect squares, a difference of squares only has two terms, okay? So someone give me an example of a perfect square. Let's say x squared, okay? Give me a number that's a perfect square. 25, okay. I have two terms, 1, 2. Both of them are perfect squares, right? This is a perfect square and this is a perfect square. What do they have to be separated by? Subtraction. That's a difference of squares. This question, I'll give you a question that looks like this, x squared minus 25, and I will tell you to factor this. The way you factor it is it's very similar to what we did before. Two things that multiply together. So same idea, perfect square. What do you do with a perfect square? Square root it. What's the square root of x squared? What's the square root of 25? Now, because the terms are separated by subtraction, what times what will give you a negative? A negative times a positive, or a positive times a negative. It doesn't matter what order you write it in. That's it. So, are both of these difference of squares? Yes, they both have two terms. They're separated by subtraction, and all the terms are perfect squares. So, what times what gives you x squared? What's the square root of 4? Negative and a positive, or a positive and a negative. Doesn't matter what order. So what is this in factored form? X minus 9, x plus 9. Square root of 81 is 9. Good.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.